Hey, what's up? This is Kristen Carter, and you are tuning in to the I Have ADHD podcast. I am medicated, caffeinated, and 100% ready to roll. I'm so glad that you press play on this podcast episode. I just love the fact that you're here with me, that we can have these conversations together, and that I'm not the only one with ADHD in the world who's trying to figure it out. So welcome. Pull up a chair or get started on that laundry, whatever it is that you're doing right now. And this is going to be a great episode. Today's guest is Dr. Robert Mellillo. He is an expert in brain health, specializing in childhood and adult neurological disorders. He's the best-selling author of the book Disconnected Kids, which you may have heard of, and he focuses on ADHD, autism, OCD, tics, anxiety, and other developmental issues. He's dedicated to bridging brain function, behavior, and physical health, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. It's a really interesting interview. It was helpful to me to ask him questions. I really wish I could have asked him 100 more questions, but we ran out of time. I really hope that you enjoy this. And hey, if you like it, share it. If you enjoy this content, hit the like, subscribe, the rating button, all of the things, no matter what platform you are listening or watching on. It would help the show so much. It helps me so much. Also, I have ADHD. I am in need of dopamine. Would you give me some dopamine today? Leave a comment, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, press the 5-star rating button on Apple or Spotify, whatever. Anything that you do in the next 5 seconds to say that you appreciate the show, it matters so much to me. I am so grateful to you. Please enjoy this interview. So Dr. Mellillo, thank you so much for being here. So glad to chat with you. I know you're calling in from New York City, not too far from me, so welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great. So I always like to ask our guests to kind of establish credibility for us. My audience comes with a really healthy dose of skepticism. And so I'm curious if you could just give us a context for who you are and the work that you do and your expertise.
Sure. Well, I've been a healthcare practitioner for 30 plus years. I have multiple degrees, and I started out with a chiropractic background, but then got a diplomate in neurology. I have a degree in neuroscience. I have a degree in clinical rehabilitation neuropsychology, and I have a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. And I've been, practicing for many, many years. I have written about over 100 scientific papers. I head up a research lab, and I'm a university professor, postgraduate professor in brain development and developmental neurology. I have written 8 best-selling books. Disconnected Kids is the best known.
Yep.
That we just came out with the 3rd edition about a month ago. And that book has been translated into 18 languages. It's one of the best-selling books of all time in the genre of ADHD, autism, neurodevelopmental disorders. I also, have done a lot of things with my wife, and I have a web series that is out there that has over 4 million views that we've gotten in the past year on Your Home TV, which is a new streaming network. So, I've been doing this a long time as a researcher, as a professor, teaching clinicians around the world, doing the actual research, publishing. We published, I think, 7 or 8 papers last year alone, just on the relationship of things like retained primitive reflexes and autism spectrum.
Is it fair to say you're obsessed with the brain?
Yeah, I mean, for me,
I'm sensing an obsession. There's a lot there.
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, when I wrote my first textbook, which is called Neurobehavioral Disorders of Childhood and Evolutionary Perspective, came out in 2004, but I started writing it way before that. Literally, I took 6 months off of practice, and I wrote by hand. I wrote 1,300 pages with 4,000 references. So it was kind of like, and it was kind of like, an obsessive type of
Yeah.
purge at that point. But so yeah, learning about the brain, understanding the brain has been a pretty much lifelong obsession for me.
Something that's really curious to me, I have so many questions for you because when I encountered your work, which was fairly recently, it is very different from what I have found in research and from ADHD experts that I've spoken to. And so I'd really like to get to the bottom of kind of the differences between what I have learned from other people and your method and your theories behind ADHD. So, my first question for you is um, you have a different perspective on the root cause of ADHD. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that. What is the root cause of ADHD?
Yeah, well, to me, it all comes down to understanding the brain, and again, I don't think I have an opinion. I think I know what the actual research says, and what our research has proven as far as what is actually happening in the brain. When you think about it, and this is the first question I ask any patient that comes into me: has anybody ever tried to explain, what is actually happening in your brain? You have a label, whether it's ADHD or OCD or whatever it may be. And has anybody explained to you what that means?
Mm.
And, virtually anybody who comes into me from anywhere all over the world, their answer is always no. No one's ever explained it to me. So I think a lot of people that are out there in the treatment world, they really don't know anything, or they don't know much about the brain. They don't really know what the problem is. And they think of it in really basic terms of biochemical imbalances. And that's not really how it works.
Mm.
So it really is about what is happening in the brain. And I wrote a very detailed paper about this last year, where what we see is, first of all, we have to define what we mean by ADHD, right? There are three different subtypes of
Yeah.
ADHD. Type 1 is the inattentive type.
Yeah.
Type 2 is the hyperactive or impulsive. Type 3 is the combined type. So all of those things represent different areas of the brain where certain areas are overactive and other areas are underactive or underdeveloped, that leads to these different types of functions or behaviors, right? And so the more traditional type of ADHD, the combined type, the hyperactive impulsive type, is, pretty clearly recognized as a right brain deficient syndrome, where certain areas in the right side of the brain. And the right side is mainly responsible for attention. There's 5 different types of human attention, and 4 of them are regulated by the brain, but especially sustained open attention, which is the kind of attention that we need in like a classroom, or that we need to, do that type of work. The left brain only has really one type of attention, and that's super detailed, hyper focused attention. And so what we see is that, certain areas of the brain, like what we call the parietal lobe, there are areas also called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. There's hyperactivity or impulsivity is generated in part by an area called the orbital frontal. So what we see is that overactivity of an area called Brodmann area 6, or the premotor area on the left side, is what causes hyperactivity or tics or stimming behavior or any of the type of overactive movement, physical movement. Overactivity on the left side of the orbital frontal causes hyperactivity or causes impulsivity. And those are all related to deficiencies in the right side. So all of this starts from the brainstem, and it's all based on maturational delays and imbalances. There's no damage in the brain. There's no genetic mutation. There's no chemical imbalance per se or metabolic issue. These have to do with the way the brain develops, grows, and the way it communicates between networks in the brain. And this developmental imbalance is the root cause of the problem.
Okay, so if you were to explain it to someone who is having trouble understanding, would, in its simplest form, be that it's a developmental imbalance in the brain? Is that kind
Yeah,
of like the
exactly.
most concise way to describe it?
Yes.
Okay.
between networks in the brain and especially between the two hemispheres of the brain. Yes.
So an imbalance between the two hemispheres in the brain.
Yes.
Okay. That's fascinating to me. And I guess as someone who has been around people with ADHD for the last 10 years and talking to experts on ADHD, I don't understand why people aren't saying this.
Right.
And you
Yeah.
must
Because
have some of that in you too. Like, hello,
yeah.
like why?
Yes.
So
No, it
help
frustrates.
me understand like why this is not like a widespread, widely held view.
Yeah, in the research areas, it is, right?
Yeah.
So, with people that really research ADHD at the highest level, most people understand that there is this right hemisphere underdevelopment and there's these imbalances in different networks in the brain.
Mm,
Um, and of course, it's much more complicated than it sounds, and it involves an area
totally.
of the brain called the basal ganglia, and there are different pathways
Yeah.
called the direct and the indirect and hyperdirect. So, it's more complicated, but essentially, that's the root cause. And again, in the scientific literature, it's out there. But the average so-called expert in ADHD doesn't really know much about the brain. Very few people actually know the brain.
Mm,
They have learned it maybe at a basic level. And so, I've spent my whole career,
yeah.
really 30 plus years, trying to understand this from a functional perspective. Because I've always believed that, understanding this is the root cause of many different types of issues. All mental health issues come down to these issues. And most physical health issues come down to this. I believe ultimately we're going to move to a brain-based model. But the bottom line is that most people out there that are dealing with this have no idea how the brain actually works. They don't know how it develops, and they don't know really, really high-level neuroscience
Yeah.
and neuroanatomy. And I do know that really well. And to me, that's the only thing that makes sense because I started out as a father of a child with
Yeah.
ADHD that knew a lot about neurology and rehabilitation. And when he was labeled with that, my first question is, well, what's actually happening in the brain?
Yeah.
And you have to think about this because you've interviewed a lot of these people. And if nobody's ever explained to you what's actually happening in the brain so that you understand it, you have to say, why would that be? That doesn't make any sense if it's a brain issue, right?
So
So,
what I have been told over and over is that the prefrontal cortex of the brain is underdeveloped. And so the
mhm.
prefrontal cortex is where all of our executive functions are housed. It's where our impulsivity and our regulation ability is housed. And so because the prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped, that is why we, myself included, with ADHD, struggle with things like attention, organization, self regulation. Is that in line with what you're saying?
Yes, but it's very, very basic
Okay,
description,
yeah,
meaning that it's not. So we have different attention networks in the brain.
yeah,
The right brain has what we call the ventral attention network. And there are different hubs in the different areas, and networks start from the bottom of the brain and work up into the brain,
mm,
right? But in one way, you're saying is correct. So there's underdevelopment. So there's
yeah,
immaturity of the prefrontal cortex, but predominantly on the right side. The left side, if anything, in most people with ADHD is more developed and may actually be beyond. So that's the thing. When I first started looking at ADHD, the first concept I came across in the research literature was something called an unevenness of skills, meaning that people with ADHD don't struggle with everything, that they're actually very gifted and very talented in certain areas and then they may struggle in others. So, right from the beginning, the description is that of some sort of imbalance.
sure.
But again, the prefrontal cortex is the last thing to develop. And there's other things that lead into that are also immature and underdeveloped. That's why the prefrontal cortex. And so we have areas like the parietal lobe, which is really where attention comes from.
Mm,
Like I said, we have another area that's called the premotor area. That is what inhibits We know that, if that area is underactive, if we don't have the proper default mode network, which is another network that is involved. And what we see is there's overactivity of those networks in the left side of the brain.
Yep.
And that is, so it's to say that it's just immaturity or underdevelopment of the prefrontal cortex is just really pointing out part of it.
Okay.
But it's really much more than that. It's really specific developmental imbalances where certain areas are overactive. That's where hyperactivity comes from, or impulsivity comes from. And there's a developmental underdevelopment of the attention networks, which are primarily those type are in the right side of the brain.
So why are these areas overdeveloping or underdeveloped? Like what causes that to
Right.
happen?
Yeah, good question. So the all of these factors, first of all, we see all of this increasing, and we are seeing an epidemic rise of it. And the reality is there are more and more people with these issues, and they're real issues. And again, there are also different versions of ADHD.
Yep.
ADHD type 1 is really more related in quite often to a left brain delay, where it's only inattentive,
Mm-mm.
and that is often associated with dyslexia or learning disabilities,
Yeah.
where you get people that may have overactivity of the right. So there are different, and that's another thing. They're very different from one another, but yet they all fall under the label of
Yeah.
ADHD. So that's why it's very confusing. You can get people that are very different personality types
Yep.
that are both claiming that they have ADHD. And it's like, wait a second, how can ADHD be all of these things
Yeah.
in these people that are very different? That's why what we talk about it is different. But essentially, it starts with a gift. It starts with people that have certain areas of their brain that are stronger than most people, right? So in people with the classic ADHD of the combined type, it's the left brain. So these people are usually highly intelligent. They may, actually read earlier. They may be really good at certain things like certain academics. They're very bright. But the right brain develops first. In the first 3 years, the right brain is developing and in the womb. So anything that might affect the development of the brain in the womb, and there are many different environmental factors that can have an impact. Um, it may have more of an effect on delaying the right brain's development. And then if the person is gifted in the left brain, it comes online too early
Mm.
and it holds back that right brain development. And it becomes the dominant brain when it's really supposed to be the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
And the right brain doesn't fully develop. And the right brain is about developing attention networks. It's about being able to develop normal social and nonverbal communication, being able to be aware of other people, emotional regulation, being able to calm ourselves down. All of those things are really what should be developing in the first 3 years. There's another thing called retained primitive reflexes. This
Yeah.
is my main area of research, and I'm kind of the world expert in it right now. Last year, we published 7 papers alone. And autism is really a very similar mechanism. It's just more extreme version of it. Okay. So when we talk about neurodivergence, we're usually talking about ADHD and autism.
Yeah.
And neurologically, they're very, very similar. And the genetics underlying them are very, very similar. So these reflexes are there to help us through early developmental movements, going through out of the womb, going through normal milestones. And then at 1 year, almost exactly, a child should walk and talk and be able to point and have joint attention. And these reflexes should go away. What our research has proven is that in many cases, these reflexes don't go away when they're supposed to. And then they hold the brain back. And again, they slow down, especially the right side, which is mainly developing. And then the left brain can come online too early. And if they don't go away at 1 when they're supposed to, they may never go away on their own, so that it affects you all the way into adulthood. So that
Yeah.
adult ADHD, almost all adult mental health issues, we understand it all starts in development. So I don't just work in pediatrics, I work in brain development.
Yeah.
And the fate of the adult brain is really determined in the first 6 years.
Totally.
And it may not show up until like the 20s when you're schizophrenic, or
Right.
bipolar may not show up until your 30s. And dementia may not show up until your 70s or 80s, but most of it all starts in childhood.
So I'm interested to talk about that, but I want to put a pin in that and just share a personal story, because you're talking about these reflexes. And I have a family member who right now is 8 years old. And when they were a toddler, they kept falling, repeatedly falling, falling, falling. And the preschool teacher counted 14 times that this kiddo fell within the 2.5 hours of preschool. And finally, it was kind of like, okay, like we need to get this kiddo assessed. And they were assessed and found that one of these reflexes, I forget the name of it, tonic something.
The asymmetric tonic neck reflex, or the
Thank you so
symmetric
much.
tonic
I
neck
believe that's
reflex,
what
or
it
the tonic
was.
labyrinthine reflex.
Okay, so I believe that's what it was. Definitely the word tonic was in there. I associated it with an adult beverage. That's probably a problem, but that's how I remembered it. And so he went to physical therapy, stopped falling, wonderful, but now is being evaluated next month for autism. And it's so
Right.
fascinating to me just to have a personal story of a kiddo in my life who, had one of those primitive reflexes never go away. And,
Right.
that was finally kind of addressed, but then now he is kind of on the pathway to being assessed and diagnosed for autism. What an interesting connection.
Yes. And that's, that the idea that movement is what drives our brain development. The reason why brains evolved on this planet, which was the subject of part of my first textbook, is because a living thing moved. Living things that don't move don't have brains, right? So movement is what initiates the need for a brain, and movement is what develops a brain in childhood first. So anything that alters movement, anything that affects normal, smooth, coordinated movement, and there's very specific blueprint of how the brain is supposed to develop. And these milestones are very important. And, lately the CDC is saying that they're not important anymore, that, even that crawling isn't even a milestone anymore, which is absolutely ridiculous.
Mm.
Because again, that's the way it's supposed to develop. And we see that most kids, especially with right brain delays, that they have problems with muscle tone. They have imbalances of tone. They're very clumsy. They have gross motor developmental delay. They miss or skip many of these milestones, and they're much later than they should. So that is not coincident. That is what we see almost 100% of the time with anybody really diagnosed with ADHD or autism or any other really neurodevelopmental issue.
I'm really interested to hear what you think about genetics and how genetics play into ADHD, because
Right.
what I have read, what I have heard from experts is that, it's highly genetic, it's highly inheritable. I think the latest study says that 74% heritability rate, which is high. Um,
Yes.
what do you see? Why is this question so hard to get out? Let me try again.
I know exactly what you're asking. And
Like,
so
where
one of
do
the biggest
genetics fit into this? Because it's really
right,
easy for people to say, like, oh, it's just genetic. It's just genetic.
right.
Like your
And
dad has it, you have it too. And like my dad has it and I have it too. So like, yeah, I can
right,
see the heritability. So can you talk
right.
to that a little bit?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's not a genetic mutation. So we have to make the distinction when people say genetic. Most people think that would mean a single gene mutation. That is not the case. That is what you would see with like Down syndrome or Fragile X, or no mental health issue is related to a single gene mutation. So what we talk about is epigenetics, right?
Yep.
Meaning that there's no damage to a gene, there's no gene injury, there's no deletion per se. but there may be genes that aren't being expressed. And the genes that are most susceptible to environmental factors are the genes that regulate brain development, because our brain is the most adaptable organ we have. It's designed to interact with the world around us. And so different environmental factors can create what's called DNA methylation, meaning we get methyl molecules that attach to parts of the gene. So when we go to transcribe and translate the gene, we go over it and we don't read it. Now, in the old days, before the year 2000 and some research, we used to think that, these marks, these methyl marks that block gene expression, that when we have a baby, it's completely wiped clean. And a baby starts with a completely clean genetic slate. So therefore, the only way to pass something down inherited was if it was an actual physical mutation of the gene that the parents would have, right? But now we know, that that's not the case, that those epi mutations, those methyl marks, can be passed down to up to 11 generations.
Everyone with ADHD knows what to do to improve their lives. You go to bed at a reasonable time and you wake up early, make a list, cross the things off the list in order. Yeah, we know what to do. But ADHD is not a disorder of not knowing what to do. It's a disorder of knowing exactly what to do, but not being able to get yourself to do it. That's why I created Focused. I'm a life coach with multiple certifications, and since 2019, I've spent thousands of hours coaching adults with ADHD. Time for me to focus on you. Hello. Welcome to your coaching call. I know what it takes to help an adult with ADHD go from hot mess express to grounded and thriving. I'll teach you how to understand your ADHD brain, regulate your emotions, and accept yourself, flaws and all. With this foundation, we build the skills to improve life with ADHD. And not only do you get skills and tools in Focused, but you're surrounded by a huge community of adults with ADHD who are also doing the work of self-development right alongside of you. Dr. Ned Hallowell says healing happens in community, and I have absolutely found this to be true. So if you're an adult with ADHD who wants to figure out how to be motivated from the inside out and make real, lasting changes in your life, join hundreds of others from around the world in Focused. Click the link in the episode description to check it out.
The idea is that, these are built on traits. So I believe, and I think it's pretty clear that we, again, are all more right hemisphere or left hemisphere dominant in the way that we see the world. And we're a little biased one way or the other. And within there are different subsets, like people that are right brain dominant. Some people might be good at music. Other people might be athletes. Other people might be just really good socially and intuitively. Other people might be inventors, or other people might be designers. With people that are left brain dominant, some people are good in math. Some people are great at reading. Some people are just really good at fine motor skills. Some people are, really super motivated. So there's different subsets within that. But that, is something, these are traits, just like, in a family where everybody's like a good athlete, or everybody, all the people are engineers, or everybody is a musician. These are family traits. And what happens, though, is that these traits, they get passed on, and these epi mutations can be passed on. But, there's nothing bad about traits. And in fact, again, as we said, most people that end up with these imbalances actually are extremely gifted. Yeah. When you have an area of your brain that you're very gifted in, and what does that mean? When you're talented or intelligent or gifted, it means that an area of your brain that controls that function is more tightly connected. It does things faster. It has more physical connectivity in that area. And so that you perform that skill better. But when you do that on one side, the other side, that same side, might be a little less than most people. And for most people, their strengths outweigh their weaknesses. But in developing, what can happen is those can become accentuated. Your strengths and weaknesses can become too great, and this imbalance between them, and then the weakness outweighs the strength. And
Yeah.
that, again, is superimposed on your natural strengths, your natural personality traits that you get from your parents, and then also on other environmental, what we call epigenetic factors that may cause those genes to be more or less expressed than they normally would be. And then this can run in families. So the good news is that, we don't want to change any family trait. That's good. We may want to balance the versions of it out so that we don't have an extreme version of that. There's no genetic mutation. And by doing things to improve the health and reduce things like inflammation or other factors, we can allow these genes to become fully expressed.
Mm.
And primarily, it's about changing the brain, and I mean physically changing the brain.
Okay, we really need to talk about physically changing the brain. But before we get there, I think it's important as someone with ADHD who helps people with ADHD to have a conversation about medication. And I've heard you say that medication is a short-term solution, not a long-term solution. Can you share your thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, medication, again, is very good at managing symptoms, but it doesn't really change the brain, right? It doesn't structurally,
Right.
physically, chemically, connectivity wise change the brain. That's why when the medication wears off, the symptoms come back.
Right.
And it's not therapeutic, meaning over time, it doesn't improve brain function. And so therefore it is, something that is there to manage symptoms, but it's not dealing with the core issue. And it doesn't change the brain in specific ways to reestablish, connectivity or functional balance between the networks of the brain.
So how does an adult with ADHD improve their brain? What Actually, let's make that a two-part question. How do you do it, when you have someone come into your center? And then after that, we can maybe talk about what can just an average listener at home, how can they make improvements? So let's talk about like the method that you use to help an adult with ADHD who walks into your center and says like, help, I'm sick of taking
Yeah.
medication. I need help with these symptoms. I'm not functioning the way I want to. What is it that you and your people do to help?
Yeah. So it's kind of like, if you said to me, somebody came in and you know, and they had like certain weaknesses or, certain problems physically, what could we do to change that? And obviously, we would put together a program that would be a series of exercises or activities or different types of stimulation. And that's the idea with the brain. The brain is an organ that creates functions. It's not chemical, right? So the idea is it's functional, meaning, areas of our brain that see, respond to light, and using our eyes and visually reading things or processing or stimulating that area of the brain with light causes it to grow and develop. And that's how it does from the beginning, right? From the beginning, as the brain builds from the bottom up, all this sensory input comes in and literally builds from the bottom up into the brain and then grows the back of the brain, which is the visual cortex, and then the temporal lobe for hearing and smell and other things, and then the parietal lobe for feeling our body and knowing where we are in space and having, feeling hot and cold and pain. And then the frontal lobe for moving our body, and then the prefrontal for cognitive skills. So we grow that area by using it, by doing it, by stimulating it. And this causes a physical growth of the brain. And so we will put together a program based on an assessment that will identify where are the weaknesses, what are the deficiencies, what areas of the brain, like, we'll do visual testing or visual processing. Do they have deficiencies in certain types of visual processing? Like the right brain does what we call global visual processing. The left brain does local or detailed processing. We look at how they perceive sounds or how they will process auditory sounds or whether they're actually registering smells, whether they feel their body in different places. Do they have a good sense of balance? Do they have their inner ear functions? Is it coming in a balanced way? Are their eyes balanced and moving? Do they have a lazy eye? Or, is there a problem with, their pupils and how they're reacting? Do they have any cognitive deficiencies? Do they have problems with certain types of memory or attention? Or, again, are they really good at word reading, but they're terrible at reading comprehension? Or they may be really good at algebra, but horrible at geometry. So there's different aspects, and all of those things correlate with different areas on different sides of the brain. So we see where there's these deficiencies. And then we put together a program that combines maybe 30 or 40 or 50 different things to target those areas of the brain in a program. If people come into our office, we do it usually in about an hour to an hour and a half. We'll work with them doing physical exercises, getting rid of these primitive reflexes. And then we have them do things with balance or with spinning or, listening to certain types of music or sound or doing things with their eyes, or they may, be on a vibe plate, or we have vibration on their body. We use different types of electrical stimulation, like a TENS unit, or we use transcranial direct current or alternating current, or we can use lasers. All of this, what it does is it really changes the frequency of networks in the brain. Ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. When we say we want to create balance, different networks will oscillate on different frequencies, ranging from what we call a delta, which is a 0 or 2 hertz, up to, goes into what we call theta, and then alpha, and then beta, and gamma, and high gamma, up to 100 hertz. So networks, to talk to one another, they have to be oscillating they have to be on the same frequency band. And as the brain matures, the brain gets faster. So if we have immature areas of the brain, it's oscillating at a slower rate than another area that may be more mature, and they can't talk to one another. So by doing stimulation, exercises, stimulus, we're literally changing the frequency, and we're causing that area to grow and mature. And then we may do things to literally quiet down or slow down the other side of the brain so they can catch up to one another and they can start to communicate with each other in a balanced way. And that's the ultimate solution.
To get both hemispheres of the brain communicating to each other in a balanced way. That's what we're looking for.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
How can someone, like an average listener who maybe doesn't have the time or money or capacity to invest in a program like yours, what kinds of tips, like what are your top 1 or 2 things that you would suggest for an ADHDer, an adult who's looking to make improvements in this balance between the 2 hemispheres of the brain?
Well, first of all, that's what my book, Disconnected Kids, is, right? So even though it says disconnected kids, it really is for adults as well, meaning because, an adult with ADHD was a kid with ADHD, right? Meaning that, so their brain really, they have to go back. And in that, it's a complete program where you can assess yourself, and then you can put together a combination of physical activities and exercises with different types of combinations of sensory stimulation, along with diet and nutrition, because the brain regulates everything. So the brain regulates the immune system and the digestive system. A lot of people are under, again, the misconception that all of this stuff starts in the gut or with diet and nutrition. It doesn't. It starts in the brainstem, in the bottom of the brain, which regulates the gut and the immune system and the balance between what we call the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems. And then ultimately it affects, these full networks in the brain, right?
Yeah.
So that's why, we have to do things from the bottom up. We have to make the foundation solid and then build it up. We can't just go to the brain and try to stimulate it. We need to do both bottom up and top down. And in my book, Disconnected Kids, I really go through how to do that and understand that diet and nutrition does play a role. Cognitive skills of some kind play a role.
Yeah.
How you use your brain, what different types of things you work at. And the basic principle is that when you do something that's hard for you, you get better at it, right? And you need to push yourself outside of the comfort zone. If you only stay in what you're comfortable with, or you only gravitate what you're good at, then you're not going to correct this imbalance, and you can't overcome these issues by doing that, right? So you need to be able to lean into your weaknesses and do things to strengthen them, and so that they can match your strengths.
Well, I have so many more questions for you, but we are out of time. I'm grateful to you for just bringing your expertise and for sharing your knowledge with us. I really appreciate you being here.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it too. And I'd love to talk to you more about it.
Yeah, thanks.